Leon was 38 years old, made $61,000 a year as a lead transit electrician for the city of Baltimore. And on a Tuesday at 4:17 p.m., his world was delivered to him in a 9x12 manila envelope. The rain outside was relentless, a cold November downpour that slicked the streets of his Edmondson neighborhood and blurred the view from his front window. He stood in the living room of the row house his grandfather had bought for $3,000 in 1958, the same house his father had been born in, the same house Leon had meticulously rewired from the knob and tube up to modern code with his own two hands. The house smelled of old wood, lemon polish, and the damp wool of his work coat hanging by the door. A man in a cheap rain-spotted suit, costing maybe $150, had handed him the envelope with a practiced indifference that made Leon's skin crawl. He hadn't needed to open it to know what it was. The sterile weight of it, the formal address block, Leon Adebayo versus Simone Adebayo, was a death certificate for his 8-year marriage. He placed the envelope on the worn oak dining table next to a bowl of plastic fruit that had been his grandmother's. For a long moment, he just stared at it, his large, capable hands resting flat on the table's surface. These were the hands that could coax life back into a dead transformer in the belly of a subway tunnel, that could trace a single faulty wire through a mile of bundled chaos. But they were trembling now, a fine, almost invisible tremor that started in his fingertips and worked its way up to his heart. His salary wasn't glamorous, not like Simone's 6-figure income as a pharmaceutical sales director, but it was honest. It was built on overtime shifts in freezing rain and sweltering summer nights, on call-outs that tore him from his bed at 3 in the morning. It was the money that had paid for the groceries, the utilities, the property taxes on this house that was his, and his alone, a fact he thought she understood. He had no idea how wrong he was. He'd always known Simone saw his work as quaint, a blue-collar novelty. He was her rugged, handy husband, a charming accessory to her polished, ambitious life. She loved to tell the story at her corporate dinner parties about how he'd fixed the faulty wiring at a 5-star restaurant where they were dining, saving the evening. Her friends would laugh, impressed, while she would pat his arm. "He fixes wires, not wealth," she'd say, with a tinkling laugh that always sounded a little too sharp. "I build the empire. He keeps the lights on." Leon would smile, a tight, practiced smile, feeling less like a husband and more like a well-maintained appliance. He had swallowed the casual condescension for years, believing it was the price of admission for loving a woman so far outside his world. He believed her ambition would lift them both. Now, holding the divorce petition, he saw it wasn't an empire she was building for them. It was an escape route for her. Have you ever felt the ground beneath your feet turn to quicksand? That feeling when a truth you built your life on is revealed as a lie? Let us know in the comments if you've ever faced a betrayal that changed everything. The facade of their life had been built with his sweat and her expensive taste. Leon remembered the day, 2 years ago. She came home with a Louis Vuitton Speedy bag, a $1,850 purchase she announced as a little treat for landing a new account. She'd placed it on the kitchen counter, its pristine brown leather, a stark contrast to his own worn Carhartt lunchbox, a $30 piece of gear that had lasted him a decade. That same week, he'd spent $90 on a new pair of steel-toed Red Wing boots, because the sole on his old ones had finally worn through after 7 years of service. He'd debated the purchase for a month, trying to find them on sale. "You deserve nice things too, Leon," she'd said, not looking up from her $1,200 iPhone 12 Pro as she admired her handbag. But her tone implied a clear distinction. Her nice things were investments in her image. His were just tools for a job. Their home was a museum of this contrast. The row house itself was modest, a 2-story brick structure with a small, neat yard. He maintained himself with a 20-year-old Craftsman mower. Inside, however, Simone had waged a quiet war against its humble origins. She'd insisted on a kitchen renovation that cost $32,000, complete with Italian marble countertops that ran $400 a square foot, and a wolf range that cost more than his 2012 Toyota Camry. Leon had done all the demolition and electrical work himself, saving them nearly $10,000 in labor, a contribution she conveniently forgot when telling her friends about her new kitchen. It was an absolute gut job, you can't imagine, she'd sigh, gesturing at the gleaming stainless steel. But you have to spend money to create value. He never corrected her. He never mentioned the 16-hour days he'd spent pulling new circuits while also working his full-time job. He remembered a Saturday afternoon in late August, the air thick and heavy. He was on a ladder in the living room, carefully patching a section of plaster ceiling that had cracked with age. It was delicate work, requiring a patient hand and an eye for detail. Sweat dripped from his brow, his deep brown skin luminous in the shafts of dusty sunlight cutting through the old window panes. Simone walked in, dressed in a $400 white linen sundress, the scent of her $250 Chanel perfume, cutting through the smell of plaster dust. She didn't look at him on the ladder. She was looking at the wall, her expression one of deep dissatisfaction. "I was just on Zillow," she announced, her voice echoing slightly in the high-ceilinged room. "There's a condo for sale in Harbor East, 2 bedrooms, floor-to-ceiling windows, a view of the water, $910,000. Leon paused, his trowel hovering over the wet plaster. "That's a lot of money, Simone." She finally turned her gaze to him, a slight wrinkle in her perfect brow. "It's an investment, Leon. This place," she waved a dismissive hand, encompassing the home his family had owned for over 60 years, "is a starter home. We're not starters anymore. I'm not anyway." The implication hung in the air between them, thick as the plaster dust on the floor. He was the starter. She had moved on to the main course. He came down from the ladder, wiping his hands on a rag. "This is my family's home, Simone. It's paid off. We have no mortgage. That's a kind of wealth, you know." She had laughed, a short, brittle sound. "Oh, Leon, that's not wealth. That's sentiment. Wealth is an asset that appreciates at 12% a year, not a pile of bricks in a neighborhood where the houses sell for $200,000 on a good day." She walked over and picked a piece of dried plaster off his coiled, natural hair, her touch light and condescending. "Don't worry, I have a plan. We just need to build our capital." He had no idea her plan for building capital involved liquidating his labor, dollar by dollar, into an account he didn't even know existed. He just thought they had different ideas about the future. He didn't realize they were living in 2 completely different marriages. The cruelty had escalated so slowly, he hadn't recognized it as a coordinated campaign. It was a series of paper cuts, small humiliations that bled him of his confidence over years. The primary architect of this was not just Simone, but her mother, Denise. Denise was a woman who appraised everything by its price tag. She saw Leon not as a son-in-law, but as a debit on her daughter's social ledger. A family dinner a year prior stood out in his memory with painful clarity. They were at the Capitol Grill, a place Simone loved, where a steak cost $80 and the wine list started at $100 a bottle. Leon felt out of place in his best $40 dress shirt from Kohl's, acutely aware of the $8,700 Armani suit on the man at the next table. Denise, draped in a St. John knit suit that cost at least $2,000, had been holding court, talking about Simone's latest sales award. "She gets her drive from me," Denise said, taking a delicate sip of her Chardonnay. "We know how to create value. We're not afraid of the work it takes to build a real life." She then turned her gaze to Leon, a saccharine smile on her face. It's a good thing my daughter is so successful, isn't it, Leon? Keeping you two afloat on that little city salary? It must be nice not having to worry about money." The table went quiet. Leon could feel the heat rise in his cheeks. He looked at Simone, expecting her to defend him, to say anything. But she just smiled, a tight, placid expression on her beautiful face. She reached over and patted his hand. "Leon is very supportive," she said, as if he were a charitable cause she sponsored. He felt 3 inches tall. He ate his $80 steak, and it tasted like ash. The physical manifestation of his stolen labor came just a few months before the divorce papers. A massive thunderstorm had rolled through Baltimore, knocking out power to a huge section of the light rail system during the evening commute. It was a Category 1 emergency. Leon was called in at 5 p.m. and didn't get home until 4 a.m. the next morning. He spent 11 hours in the pouring, freezing rain, 30 feet up in a bucket truck, wrestling with thick, high-voltage cables that hissed and spat in the wet air. His hands were numb, his body soaked through, but when the lights finally flickered back on and the first train rolled through the station, a surge of pride cut through his exhaustion. He had done that. He had restored a piece of the city's pulse. He arrived home leaving his mud-caked, $45 work boots on the porch as he always did. The house was dark and silent. He crept into their bedroom, hoping not to wake Simone. As he peeled off his wet clothes, she stirred. She didn't ask if he was okay. She didn't ask what had happened. She sat up, sniffed the air, and said, "Leon, you smell like wet metal. And did you bring those filthy boots inside?" The mud stains the porch paint. He stood there, shivering and exhausted, a man who had just spent half a day battling a storm for the city, being reprimanded for the smell of his labor. "I left them outside," he said, his voice flat. "Sorry." She sighed, a dramatic, put-upon sound, and rolled back over, pulling the $500 duvet over her head. The overtime pay for that brutal 11-hour shift, a total of $942, was one of the last deposits he would later discover was routed directly into her mother's bank account. The final piece of the puzzle, the one he hadn't understood at the time, clicked into place just weeks before the end. He was in the kitchen making coffee at 6:15 a.m. when he heard Simone's low voice from the living room. She was on the phone, likely with her mother. He couldn't hear the whole conversation, just snippets that floated through the quiet house. "But no, he has no idea. He's not a numbers guy, Mom. He just signs the deposit slips I put in front of him. He thinks it's all going into the joint savings. Yes, for the down payment. Of course he trusts me." Leon froze, the coffee scoop halfway to the machine. A cold dread, sharp and acidic, washed over him. Deposit slips? He deposited his checks via a mobile app. The only slips he signed were for his overtime, which Simone had insisted on handling, claiming she could get a better interest rate by depositing them through a special account linked to her portfolio. "It's how we build our capital, baby," she'd said. He had trusted her. He had believed they were a team. He shook his head, pushing the sinister thought away. He was tired. He was mishearing things. It was a misunderstanding. He poured his coffee, the bitter taste a premonition of the truth that was coming for him. Now, in the rain-soaked quiet of his living room, the manila envelope lay on the table like a bomb. He finally slid it open with a kitchen knife, his movements slow and deliberate. The documents inside were cold to the touch: summons, petition for dissolution of marriage, financial affidavits. He scanned the pages, his heart a heavy, rhythmic drum against his ribs. Simone's stated income was accurate. Her list of assets was long and detailed. Her 401k worth $250,000. her stock portfolio worth another $100,000, her white BMW 3 Series, valued at $43,000. Then he got to the section listing his assets. It listed his city pension, valued at $78,000, and then, under real estate, it listed the row house. Marital property, it said, with an estimated value of $220,000 to be sold and proceeds divided. A cold fury, unlike anything he had ever felt, began to build in his chest. Marital property? This house had been in his family for 3 generations. It was his birthright, the one true thing he owned, free and clear. He flipped the page, and that's when he saw it. Page 7. A section titled Waiver of Interest in Non-Marital Trusts. It was a dense block of legalese, but a few phrases jumped out. Hereby waives any and all current or future claim. Irrevocable trust, established by Marcus Adebayo. Beneficiary, Leon Adebayo. And there, at the bottom of the paragraph, on the line designated for his signature, were 2 neatly penned initials, L.A. He stared at them. He had never seen this document before in his life. He had never signed it. She had forged his initials. She had tried to get him to sign away his inheritance without him even knowing it existed. The rain beat against the window pane, each drop a hammer blow against the fragile structure of his life. He sank into a chair, the papers rattling in his hand, the overheard phone call, the deposit slips, the condescension, the dinner with her mother. It wasn't a series of random slights, it was a plan, a long, carefully executed strategy to strip him of his dignity, his labor, and finally, his legacy. She hadn't just fallen out of love with him. She had been actively plotting his financial ruin while sleeping next to him every night. She thought he was simple. A man who fixed wires, who wouldn't read the fine print. She thought he was stupid enough to sign his own dispossession. That was her first mistake. But forging his initials on a document referencing a trust she clearly didn't understand, that was her last. Because Leon knew exactly what the Marcus Adebayo Irrevocable Trust was. His father, a man who fixed buses for the same transit authority Leon worked for, had been quiet, but he hadn't been a fool. And he had made sure his son would never be a fool either. The days that followed were a master class in restraint. Leon moved through his life with a calm that felt alien in his own body. On the outside, he was the same man. He went to work, he came home, he ate the dinners Simone prepared, food that now tasted like poison. But on the inside, a cold, methodical engine had started to turn. He was no longer a husband. He was an investigator gathering evidence against an adversary. The first test came that very night. He was sitting at the oak dining table, the divorce papers hidden away in the toolbox in his Camry's trunk. Simone came home at 7:30 p.m., carrying a takeout bag from a Thai restaurant that cost $60. She was humming, a cheerful, carefree sound that grated on his raw nerves. She set the table, chattering about a difficult client and a new marketing campaign. She seemed lighter, happier than she had in months. It was the buoyancy of a person who believes they have successfully jettisoned dead weight. "How was your day, honey?" she asked, her voice bright. Leon looked up from his plate of Pad See Ew. He met her eyes, his own expression carefully neutral. It was fine. Fixed a signal switch at the Camden Yards station. Long day. He kept his voice even, his breathing steady. His heart was hammering. A frantic bird trapped in his chest, but his hands were rock solid as he picked up his fork. "Pass the salt?" he asked. She did, her fingers brushing his, and he felt nothing. No spark, no anger, just a profound and chilling emptiness. She had no idea she was dining with a ghost. The next day, he put the second part of his quiet investigation into motion. While she was at work, He went into the small home office they shared. He had always hated the room. She had decorated it in a cold, minimalist style. A $10,000 Eames chair, a glass desk, white walls, with a single abstract painting that looked like a black smear. It was her space. He rarely entered it. He went to the filing cabinet, a sleek, $300 metal unit. He opened the drawer labeled Financials. Inside were dozens of neatly organized files. He found the one labeled Joint Savings. Inside were bank statements, and tucked in the back, just as he'd hoped, was a folder of deposit slips. His overtime deposits. He pulled them out. Each one was a carbon copy slip from a bank he didn't use, Denise's bank. And each one was made out not to a joint account, but to an account number he didn't recognize. He took out his phone and photographed every single one. 53 slips in total, dating back 4.5 years. The dates, the amounts, the foreign account number, it was all there. A meticulous record of her theft. That evening, he staged his final test. He sat on the sofa, pretending to watch TV, the copied slips on the coffee table, as if he'd just stumbled across them. When Simone came in, he picked them up. "Hey, honey," he said, his tone one of mild, domestic confusion. "I was looking for these for my records, the OT deposits. I couldn't find them in our online banking app. Which account did you say these were going into again? The joint savings?" He watched her face. For a split second, a flicker of something, panic, maybe, crossed her features, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by a dazzling smile. She walked over, sat beside him, and took the slips from his hand. "Of course, baby. The high-yield joint savings. It doesn't show up on the main app, remember? It's a special portfolio account. It's how we're building our future." She leaned in and kissed his cheek. Her skin was cold. The lie was so smooth, so practiced, it was almost impressive. He nodded slowly, pretending to accept the explanation. "Right. The portfolio account. Got it." He turned back to the TV, his face a mask of normalcy. Inside, the cold engine was humming, fully fueled. He had everything he needed. What would you do in Leon's shoes? Confront her right away or play the long game? Share your strategy in the comments below. On Thursday morning at 9 a.m., Leon walked into the law offices of Adebayo and Associates. The firm was located in a modest but dignified brownstone in Mount Vernon, a world away from the gleaming glass towers downtown where Simone's lawyer likely operated. David Adebayo was his cousin, though they were more like brothers. He was a second-generation lawyer who had taken over the practice from his father, who had been Leon's father's best friend and personal attorney. David was a sharp, impeccably dressed black man with a mind like a steel trap and a deep, calming voice. He greeted Leon not with a handshake, but with a firm hug. "Leo, it's been too long," David said, leading him into a conference room that smelled of old books and fresh coffee. "What's going on? You sounded serious on the phone." Leon didn't waste time. He laid the manila envelope on the polished mahogany table. Then he placed the stack of photos of the deposit slips beside it. Finally, he pulled out a thick, leather-bound folder. "This is my father's trust document," he said. David's eyebrows shot up. He opened the divorce petition first, his eyes scanning the pages with incredible speed. He paused on page 7, his expression hardening. He looked at the forged initials, then at Leon. "You didn't sign this." It wasn't a question. "No," Leon said. "Never saw it before Tuesday." David pushed the petition aside and opened the leather-bound folder. For the next 30 minutes, there was silence in the room, broken only by the rustle of paper and the distant sound of city traffic. David read every word of the trust his father had drafted 20 years ago. The Marcus Adebayo Irrevocable Trust was a work of quiet genius, Established a year before Leon even met Simone, it named Leon as the sole beneficiary. Its primary assets were the deed to the Edmondson row house and the articles of incorporation for a small LLC, Adebayo Electric, which his father had set up for him as a shell company, waiting for the day Leon would start his own business. Because these assets were placed in the trust before the marriage, they were legally firewalled. They were not, and could never be, marital property. Simone's attempt to have him waive his rights was legally meaningless, but her act of forging his initials on a legal document was something else entirely. It was fraud. Then David found the clause that made his lips curve into a grim smile. It was on page 12, a section titled Protection of Beneficiary Assets. Leon's father, a man who had seen friends lose everything in bitter divorces, had included a clawback provision. It stated that any funds or income belonging to the beneficiary, Leon, that were improperly or fraudulently diverted to a third party by a spouse or relation by marriage, were to be considered a debt owed to the trust. The trust had the right to demand immediate repayment of all diverted funds, plus a 25% penalty for willful financial malfeasance. David leaned back in his chair, his eyes gleaming. Your father was a brilliant man, Leo. A truly brilliant man. He picked up the photos of the deposit slips. So, these are your overtime checks? Leon nodded. Every single one for the last 4.5 years. David began to do the math on a legal pad. He cross-referenced the dates and amounts with Leon's pay stubs, which Leon had brought with him. The numbers were staggering. 53 deposits. A total of $87,450. $87,000, siphoned off into an account you don't recognize, David said, his voice low and dangerous. And according to this, the account is at her mother's bank. He tapped the clawback clause, which means Simone and her mother, Denise, are now jointly in debt to your father's trust for that amount, plus a 25% penalty. He scribbled on the pad. That comes to $109,312.50. They don't just not get the house. They owe you money. A lot of it. Leon felt a wave of dizziness. He had come in here expecting to fight to keep his house. He was walking out with an ironclad case that would not only protect his home, but would call to account every dollar they had stolen from him. So what's the plan? Leon asked, his voice hoarse. David's smile was gone, replaced by a look of cold, professional focus. The plan is simple. She fired the first shot by serving you these papers. She thinks she's ambushing a foot soldier. She has no idea she just declared war on a fortress. We don't respond to her petition. We don't negotiate. We counterattack. My office will contact her lawyer tomorrow morning. We will inform him that his client has filed a fraudulent document with the court, that she is party to a scheme to defraud an irrevocable trust, and that we are formally invoking the repayment clause. Her divorce petition isn't just dead. It's about to become the single most expensive mistake of her life. The strike was executed with the precision of a surgical procedure. It happened on Friday at 11 a.m. Leon was exactly where he wanted to be, deep in the earth, 50 feet below the streets of downtown Baltimore, in the echoing darkness of a subway tunnel. He was part of a team upgrading the signal systems near the Charles Center station. The air was cool and smelled of steel dust and electricity. His phone had no service. He was unreachable, insulated from the blast wave he knew was about to hit the surface. He was focused on his work, his hands steady as he stripped the thick orange casing off a fiber optic cable. Down here, the world was simple. There was a problem, and he was the solution. There was order. There was logic. A current flowed where it was supposed to flow. At that exact moment, in a sleek, glass-walled office, On the 25th floor of a building overlooking the Inner Harbor, David Adebayo was making a phone call. He was calling a man named Richard Sterling, Simone's attorney. As David would later recount to Leon, the conversation was brief and brutal. "Mr. Sterling, David Adebayo, calling on behalf of Leon Adebayo. I trust you've received my email." There was a pause on the other end. Sterling was a high-priced divorce lawyer, used to dealing with emotional, messy disputes. He likely expected a call to negotiate terms, to plead for a better settlement. "Yes, I see it here," Sterling said, his voice smooth and confident. "A bit of a dense document. A family trust?" "It is," David said, his voice flat and cold. "It's the irrevocable trust that holds the deed to my client's family home, an asset he owned free and clear a full year before he ever met your client. An asset that is therefore not marital property and not subject to division. I draw your attention to page 2, section 3. David could hear the faint clicking of a mouse on the other end of the line. Then a longer pause. "I see," Sterling said, his voice losing some of its easy confidence. "I also draw your attention to the document you filed with the court on behalf of your client," David continued, his voice like ice. "Specifically, page 7, the waiver of interest. My client has signed an affidavit stating he has never seen that document before, and that the initials on the signature line are a forgery. Filing a fraudulent document is a serious matter, as you know." The silence on the other end of the line was now profound. David let it hang in the air. "And finally," he said, delivering the killing blow, "I draw your attention to the trust document, page 12, section 8, the clawback provision. I have attached to my email 53 scanned deposit slips, along with my client's corresponding pay stubs, documenting the fraudulent diversion of $87,450 of his income by your client and her mother, Denise Hale, into an account in Ms. Hale's name. As per the terms of the trust, we are formally demanding full repayment, plus the stipulated 25% penalty. A demand letter for $109,312.50 will be delivered to your office and to Ms. Hale by courier this afternoon." David finished. "Mr. Sterling, your client's petition for divorce is based on fraud and misrepresentation. We expect it to be withdrawn immediately. If it is not, we will be filing a civil suit against both Ms. Adebayo and Ms. Hale for fraud and conversion, and we will be petitioning the court for sanctions against your client for filing a fraudulent claim. You have 2 hours to confer with your client. I expect to hear from you by 1 p.m. He then hung up the phone. Meanwhile, Simone was having lunch at Azumi in Harbor East, a restaurant so exclusive the water was flown in from Norway. She was with 2 of her friends, celebrating her impending freedom. Her white BMW was with the valet. She was likely holding her $1,200 iPhone, laughing as she showed them pictures of the $910,000 condo she was going to buy with her half of the house money. Her phone buzzed. The caller ID read, "Sterling and Price." She probably excused herself with a smug smile, expecting an update on how quickly Leon was going to capitulate. She stepped out onto the waterfront promenade, the November air crisp and cold. "Richard, any news?" she likely said, her voice full of confident expectation. And then, the world as she knew it ended. She would have heard the words, irrevocable trust, not marital property, forgery, fraud, clawback clause, $87,000. Her mother's name. $109,000 owed. The color would have drained from her face. The sounds of the harbor, the seagulls, the distant foghorn, the traffic on President Street would have faded into a dull roar. Her hand, the one wearing the 3-carat $30,000 diamond ring Leon's savings had helped buy, would have started to shake. She wasn't getting a payday. She wasn't getting the condo. She was in debt. She had implicated her own mother in a federal crime. She had underestimated the quiet man who fixed wires, and in doing so, she had torched her entire life. The fallout was not a single explosion, but a cascade of failures, each one triggering the next. The consequences were swift, merciless, and meticulously documented. First, at 12:47 p.m. that same Friday, less than 2 hours after David Adebayo's call, a panicked Richard Sterling called back. He informed David that his client, Simone Adebayo, was withdrawing her petition for divorce effective immediately. The official paperwork was filed by the end of the business day. The first domino had fallen. Her grand liberation had lasted less than 72 hours. Second, at 3:15 p.m., a legal courier delivered the formal demand letter to Simone at her office and to Denise Hale at her pristine suburban home in Owings Mills. The letter, printed on heavy bond paper, outlined the debt in cold, hard numbers. $87,450 in diverted funds, plus a $21,862.50 penalty, for a total of $109,312.50 payable to the Marcus Adebayo Irrevocable Trust within 30 days. The life they had built on Leon's stolen labor now had a price tag, and the bill was due. Third, the financial collapse began. Denise, whose entire net worth was tied up in her home and a modest retirement annuity, was forced to liquidate the entire $75,000 annuity to cover her portion of the debt. The savings she had spent 30 years building were wiped out in a single transaction to cover the cost of her greed. She was left with only her Social Security, her pride shattered. Fourth, Simone had to come up with the remaining $34,312.50. The only significant asset she had that wasn't in a protected retirement account was her car. She was forced to sell the white BMW 3 Series she adored, the ultimate symbol of her success. She got $38,000 for it in a private sale, a painful loss from its $43,000 value. After paying off the debt, she was left with less than $4,000. She was now driving a 10-year-old Honda Civic, a constant, humiliating reminder of her downfall. Fifth, her dream of a glass tower in Harbor East evaporated. With a massive withdrawal from her savings and the sale of her car, any chance of securing a loan for a $910,000 condo was gone. Her credit was intact, but her capital was destroyed. She was trapped, forced to find a small one-bedroom rental apartment in Towson for $1,800 a month, a far cry from the waterfront views she had felt was her destiny. Sixth, and perhaps most devastating, was the social implosion. The family and friends to whom she and her mother had spent years painting Leon as a financial deadbeat now knew the truth. The story, in all its sordid detail, came out. They hadn't just separated. She had been caught in a massive financial fraud against him, a scheme so audacious it had backfired spectacularly. The whispers followed her everywhere. The friends she celebrated with at Azumi no longer returned her calls. The invitations to dinner parties stopped coming. She was no longer the successful, self-made woman. She was a cautionary tale, a thief who had been exposed by the quiet, simple man she had so thoroughly underestimated. Her reputation, an asset she valued above all else, was now worthless. 1 year later, the sun was bright and warm for a crisp October Saturday. Leon sat on the newly painted front porch of his row house in Edmondson, a simple white ceramic mug of coffee warming his hands. The house looked better than it ever had. The old brick had been repointed, the window frames painted a deep, dignified black, and the small garden in the front yard was bursting with yellow and orange mums. Parked at the curb was a brand-new Ford Transit van, a pristine white vessel of his independence. On the side, in clean, bold lettering, It read Adebayo Electrical, LLC, licensed and insured. The $109,000, once it was repaid to the trust, had become the seed money his father had always intended for him. He had used it to get his master electrician's license, purchase the best tools, and buy the van. In less than 6 months, he had more work than he could handle. He was hiring 2 other electricians from the neighborhood, good men who needed a chance. He was earning more than he ever had with the city, but it wasn't the money that felt good. It was the quiet satisfaction of building something with his own hands, on his own terms. His name was on the side of the van, a testament to his skill and his integrity. He took a slow sip of his coffee. The peace he felt was profound. It wasn't the giddy excitement Simone had always chased. It was a deep, foundational calm. It was the feeling of standing on solid ground. He had forgiven Simone, not for her sake, but for his. Holding on to that bitterness would have been like letting her live in his house, rent-free forever. He had simply moved on, closing the door on that chapter of his life with a quiet finality. He thought about his father, the man who fixed buses and had the foresight of a king. His father had understood that true wealth wasn't about flashy cars or waterfront condos. It was about independence. It was about having a skill no one could take from you and owning a piece of the earth that was yours alone. It was about building a foundation so strong that when the storms came, and they always did, you would still be standing when the sun came out again. The real empires, Leon now knew, aren't built in glass towers overlooking a harbor. They are built in the quiet, unseen places, in the strength of a family's legacy, in the integrity of a day's hard work, and in the character of a person who knows their own worth, even when others try to tell them they have none. True wealth is not what you can buy, but what you can build. And what you build with your own 2 hands, with honesty and pride, can never truly be stolen. We all face moments where we are underestimated. If Leon's journey from betrayal to triumph resonated with you, please consider sharing this story with someone who might need a reminder of their own strength. Thank you for being part of our community.